Thank you, and I'm delighted to be here at GFN for the first time, and I'm very grateful to Jerry and to Caitlin for inviting me here. Okay, so about me. I'm a researcher, as Caitlin said, and I'd like to thank also Cancer Research UK, who fund my current research. Which is, what I'm doing is I'm getting to know smokers and ex-smokers who've tried electronic cigarettes or who are currently using them in two areas of the north of England, two very deprived areas, one in the northwest, one in the northeast, which you can see on the map. I've also done a little bit of pilot work in northern France, but I haven't got any funding for that, though I'd like to. And I'm also talking to vape shop staff, so I'm seeing 10 shops in each area and 20 smokers trying to use e-cigs or succeeding in using e-cigs. Thank you. In each area. And the people I'm talking to are largely unemployed, or they work in manual work, such as construction, bus drivers, factory work, care work, cleaning, bar work, that sort of thing. So that gives you an idea of the sort of population. Okay, so what are the problems with electronic cigarettes for poor smokers? So the first one, which everyone is aware of, is potentially cost. So obviously there's the capital cost of a starter kit, but the way I think of that and the way I've seen that in the field is also opportunity cost, because the money that you spend on your starter kit is also money that you can't spend on tobacco. So you got this starter kit and you're not sure whether it's going to work, and you're worried that if it doesn't work, you haven't got the money for that week's tobacco, so that is an issue. And it's also a repeated cost, because people might think, well, you get the starter kit and then you just need the liquid and there's the cost of that. But in fact, in practice, you get a cheap e-cig starter kit, and it leaks, it bubbles, you lose it, etc., etc. So it's easily broken or dropped or stolen. And people I've met who've saved up to buy a more expensive model, or who've been given one perhaps by a family member, have then lost that or dropped it somewhere and then haven't bought another one, can't afford to buy another one. Also, confusing information, which obviously we've heard a lot about, misinformation about health effects, but also people worried about addiction and continued addiction, and seeing any kind of addiction as a moral problem, as something that, one thing is being addicted to e-cigs for a lot of people feels bad, and as bad for them sometimes as smoking, just because addiction is so stigmatized. The fact that they don't get any advice from obviously non-specialist shops selling electronic cigarettes, and also online. And that even in vape shops, there's very variable advice. There are some vape shops which are wonderful and support people through the process and deal with all the technical issues and are always available. But there are other shops that engage in upselling, and that also tell you that you can only quit with a particular type, that you can't quit with the most basic ones, which people do quit with them, even though you might have a better experience with something more elaborate. And then finally, how much nicotine to use. And Jacques Le Wezek spoke yesterday about that, about the importance of getting the nicotine dose right, and that's something that obviously causes confusion. Having said that, what I am seeing is that informal outlets and word of mouth and kind of informal peer advice is gaining ground as more people are using e-cigs, and there's more people available in the community, relatives and friends, who can give advice, and also on things like market stalls, like the one I'm showing here. So that's a kind of optimistic point, if you like. Right, so the next problem is, another barrier is that e-cigs are difficult to use when you first start, that they can be unreliable, especially the cheap ones, that I'm sure people have experienced when they first started, spills and leaks and bubbling and cracking and all these things that you get certainly with the Generation 2, and burning out the coil because you didn't realize about putting the liquid in, all those things that happen. And then fiddliness, they do require a certain level of manual dexterity and reasonable vision, which to the kind of younger vapor may not be obvious, but if older people, if you've got arthritis, it's actually quite difficult to deal with screwing the little bits in and out and getting the poisoning the bottle over the little hole you put the liquid in, and all those bits which seem obvious to many of us. Running out of charge, obviously, and running out of liquid are opportunities for relapse, and that often happens. And it's still easier to buy cigarettes when you run out than it is to buy the e-liquid that you're looking for. And also parts not being compatible. Particular firms, which are remain nameless, are notorious for having parts that don't fit with anybody else's parts, so you can't get a coil that fits their particular e-cig from someone else. And finally, the newer pods like Juul, which we've heard about, are obviously a lot easier to use, but they're also more expensive. So if you contrast all that with a cigarette, which is ever reliable, never replicable, because if you drop one or break it or sit on it or whatever, then you can just get another one out of the packet. So it's just so much easier. This image, the image I had in the background there, I'll just reproduce it for you again, because I see it as a kind of visual representation of the ratio of smokers and vapors in the kind of communities that I'm working in. If you think of the cigarette butts there, and then there's one lone packet of Hyzen e-liquid lying there belonging to the lone vapor amongst the smokers. So it's a little bit depressing, but I thought it was quite a good image. However, I've listed some of those barriers, none of which I think will be new to most of you. But the big question is, do they apply to poor smokers more than to other smokers? Because that's what I'm concerned with. And I think there's a risk here of patronizing poorer smokers by assuming that they're incapable and can't do these complicated things to do with e-cigs. So I'll go through the elements in turn. So on confusing information, does that barrier apply more to poor smokers? Well, I'd argue probably not, in fact, because I think that what I find in the people I talk to is actually they take rather less notice of what they say, whether they is public health or whether it's the sun or whether it's tobacco, whoever it is, the powers that be, than we think they do. And although we know that people talk about their fears about safety, I've also found that to be a defensive reaction and a way of closing down a conversation when you don't want to talk about giving up smoking. So you might not really believe that, but it's easy to stop an inquisitive researcher by saying, oh, well, I've just read that they're much more dangerous, so, that shuts me up, or whoever. So I think we can be more optimistic than those figures about concern about health would suggest. Difficulty of use. Well, again, I think it can be patronizing to say that poor people necessarily find it harder to manage the technicalities of electronic cigarettes. And I think we found, well, you'll have noticed both today and yesterday that some highly educated people are incapable of following quite simple directions like talking for 15 minutes. Expensive. Or even on expense. I think that's not as much a barrier as you might think. Because what I've found in my research is that people show amazing creativity. It's rather like what Annie was just saying, so what Helen was saying about the energy people put into drug use. That if people want something, they'll find ways and means of getting it. And people are very, very creative about finding e-liquids and getting e-cigs at the right price from wherever. So this image here this is what Harry had in his pocket. And Harry is 77. He's an ex-coal miner and a vapor. And he had this little collection. It's what he happened to have on him at the time. So he's got one of them which you'll recognize as being a brand which you see everywhere in pound shops, which cost £1, obviously. There's also a tobacco industry one, which was a gift from his daughter. He would never pay that kind of money. And then there's a couple of others, I forget where he got them, but possibly car boot sale or a friend or a swap or something. So the people I'm talking to who have switched, they've got no brand loyalty. They get the cheapest liquids, or they make their own. In fact, Harry told me once that he ran out of e-liquid, and he calls it his oils. He calls it his pipe and his oils, and he ran out of oils. So he decided to try cooking oil, which didn't go too well, actually. But I think in most cases, people making their own liquids rarely causes a lot of problems. So if it's not the cost, what are the barriers that are specific to poor smokers? And are they more to do, as I'm suggesting, more to do with smoking and the difficulty of moving from smoking than with problems with switching to vaping, if you see the distinction. By the way, that slide should say barriers to vaping at the top. That's just a typo, sorry about that. It should say barriers to vaping for poor smokers, just to clarify that. So the first point is denormalization, or what denormalization, as I say. Because we say we might have a smoking prevalence of, let's say, 20%, for the sake of argument. But what that translates into is 5%, let's say, in rich areas, and 35%, or sometimes more, in poor areas. So you've got some areas which are denormalized, and other areas which have never been denormalized. And I had a research participant who's aged 20. I think she's been smoking since she was 14 or 15, like most people I know. And she said that, I mentioned this about stigma. I didn't use this word stigma, but I mentioned this about acceptability. And she said, oh no, smoking's much more acceptable than when I was young. It's much more acceptable now. You know, people are quite happy about it. So, you know, well, I'll leave it at that. And the second point is that smoking is still part of the fabric of everyday life. So it's people have memories of things that have gone now. We've forgotten about them, but they're not that long ago, like cigarette coupons. And people have things like towels and plates and pictures in their house, which they bought with cigarette coupons. And they've got happy memories of going through the cigarette coupon catalogue and swapping coupons with other people because they didn't have quite enough to buy the particular item they wanted. And that's all, you know, that's all to do with, you know, people's everyday life. And sponsorship by cigarette companies, not of glamorous things like car racing, but holiday camps for working class people like Butlins and Pontins, where the chalets were called after cigarettes, and the Castella house would compete against the Benson and Hedges house, and the kids in the swimming pool would cheer on Benson and Hedges or shout out Lambert and Butler, or beat up the Lambert and Butler kids. So that's all people's memories, and that's all very much present in the fabric of people's lives. And I think we're in danger of forgetting that and seeing it something that's long gone. And the next thing is smoking cessation as a betrayal of sociability, because smoking has long been associated with being sociable and being hospitable, and that's not something the tobacco industry has created. That was a pre-existing thing, but obviously it plays to their advantage. And Jude Robinson and Claire Holdsworth have written about that, and the difficulty of young mothers in creating smoke-free spaces while still being hospitable and sociable in their social circle. And finally, problems with smoking cessation as being seen as pretentious, and excessive attention to one's health being seen as a kind of feminized and middle-class indulgence by working-class men in particular. So smoking cessation itself is this kind of wussy, kind of something you can't do as a man, unmasculine, and a way of saying you're separating yourself off from the community. And of course, the link between smoking and sociality is being reinforced all the time by tobacco companies in most of the world, not in the UK, where I am, but because of the laws about advertising, but in most of the world it still is the case. And I particularly like these images because it's basically, well, you can see the 1970s camel ad has exactly the same image of male sociality as the 2013 Sampurna ad, which is a company owned by Philip Morris in Indonesia. So I think we need to remember that somebody said yesterday in a question that the tobacco industry have done terrible things in the past. And I was shocked by that, because we need to remember that they're still doing terrible things wherever they can get away with it. Just because some sections are also doing good things in harm reduction. And I spoke to a vaping advocate yesterday, and he said about this, and he said, I know who's attacking me, and it's not them. It's not the tobacco industry. And I think one of the sad things about some of the public health opposition to electronic cigarettes is that it's driving vaping advocates into the arms of the tobacco industry on the basis that your enemy, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Sorry, got that bit wrong. So what should we be doing on harm reduction and poor smokers? Well, on the smoking cessation as betrayal of sociality, we need to make vaping a good sociable alternative to smoking, which means avoiding unnecessary restrictions on where you can vape. That much is obvious. And Sarah Jake spoke yesterday on pleasure. I think it's very important. So this issue of smoking cessation is pretentious. We need to avoid alternatives to smoking being medicalized and emphasize the role of pleasure and maximize the variety and of flavors and types available. And then lastly, realizing that tobacco companies have not changed. We need to work particularly with the independent vape industry, because I do find on the ground that vape shops feel strongly about the tobacco industry, and every day they refuse to sell their products. Every day they're approached by tobacco industry reps, and they say no to them. And they also refuse to work in partnership with them when they're asked, and they refuse to sell out to them. And I think we should be listening to them and working in solidarity with poor smokers in high-income countries, like the people I search, and also with low- and middle-income countries, where the tobacco epidemic is still raging uncontrolled. Thank you.